We're now going to talk about monetary policy, but monetary policy focusing on stabilizing the domestic economy. And we're going to focus on the traditional idea that lowering the interest rate stimulates the economy. The Fed can affect the general interest rate in a general way whenever it buys or sells bonds, in particular US Treasury bonds. If the Fed buys US Treasury bonds on a large scale, that drives the price of Treasury bonds up. That's the demand and supply model idea. And if the price of bonds go up, the yield goes down, and if the yield goes down, that's like saying the interest rate is going down. So there's this very broad general channel of trying to affect market interest rates generally through open market operations. But the Fed also can try to target one specific interest rate, and that's the federal funds rate. That's the market-determined rate at which banks will lend to each other. And the reason the Fed can target that interest rate very specifically is because the Fed controls something called the discount rate, and it controls the rate of interest that it will pay on bank reserves. Now we'll get to that a bit later. So the federal funds rate is an interest rate that can be targeted more precisely and more accurately by the Fed because it exploits the requirement that banks, now here I'm talking of depository institutions, by the way. So banks in this context, federal funds rate means depository institutions. So the Fed can target this federal funds rate, interest rate, in a way it cannot do for interest rates generally. And the reason is the Fed has some special control over the reserves that banks have at the Fed. So backing off to the big picture again, the essence is the Fed can try to influence interest rates in the economy generally because it's simply a big player in financial markets. It can buy or sell securities on a large scale and do other things as well. And since interest rates and specific interest rates are mostly a market-determined price, the Fed, acting as a demander or a supplier, can influence that price. I'll use an analogy from the real world. Let's imagine there's a company that is the biggest supplier of apples in the United States. Simply by its position as a major supplier of apples, it can, up to a point, attempt to influence the price of apples in the United States by supplying more or withholding supply. So that's where the Fed is like the big player in financial markets and can influence market prices. And as a peripheral thing that we won't really talk about here, the Fed also determines the money supply. Now, the money supply control comes in mostly when we talk about the Fed targeting inflation. But we're not going to be talking about inflation here. Okay, so the money supply will not play much of a role in the discussion. I'm going to jump right in and talk about how complicated it can actually be for the Fed to try to influence interest rates. Now, in the story we talked about before, there's a demand and supply for bonds. The Fed can buy bonds, the Fed can sell bonds. Seems pretty simple, right? But what if the Fed, through buying bonds, drives the interest rate all the way down to zero? This situation is called the zero lower bound. And the conventional thinking was once interest rates hit zero, that's as low as they can go. So if the Fed wants to do even more stimulation, it will have to do something, there'll have to be something else done. And the something else was usually that now the federal government has to step in and run deficit budget spending. Okay, so once interest rates were driven down to zero, the traditional idea was there was nothing more the Fed could do to stimulate the economy. So the US government now can only push for fiscal policy deficit spending as the only remaining policy tool to do more stimulation. However, as we have found, believe it or not, interest rates have actually become negative. Now this is sort of extraordinary. Let's think about it for a minute. A negative interest rate means that if I put $1,000 on reserve somewhere, not only am I getting zero interest, I actually have to pay whoever is holding my cash a percent, sort of like a fee for simply sitting on my money. Now this sounds really strange, and the reason it was thought to be impossible to have negative interest rates is the idea that at the worst case, banks and other big organizations would rather just sit on their cash if the interest rate reached zero. But the idea that they would deposit it with a bank at negative interest rate, or there are other ways the negative interest rate can be manifested. The idea that a big organization would actually sustain and tolerate a negative interest rate, that was unthinkable. So what possible explanation is there for negative interest rates? Well, the only plausible explanation is that somehow the liquidity property of money, the fact that money is liquid, makes it valuable to hold even when you earn zero interest. So if you imagine a bank, a depository institution that is paranoid about becoming insolvent, perhaps because it owns some really bad assets, maybe it's willing to hold on to money even if it's earning negative interest. So if you think of it that way, that it's liquidity that explains negative interest rates, then what can the Fed do? Well, one thing the Fed could do is purchase risky assets like mortgage-backed securities, so the banks would become less extremely risk averse and be willing to start making loans to business at a positive interest rate. Okay? So summary, negative interest rates can only really make sense in a world where there's fear of becoming insolvent. So, to repeat, if banks fear some of their assets like mortgage-backed securities or derivatives will become worthless, they fear becoming insolvent. So they crave liquidity and will even accept zero return on cash balances as the price for having cash on hand. Or if they had to, they'd even be willing to accept a negative interest rate on reserves. And a different way to think about this, or another way to think about this, is our traditional bond demand and supply model is a two-dimensional model. There's price on one axis and quantity on the horizontal axis, and there's demand for bonds and supply of bonds, and really there is only one market price behind the scenes that gets determined, and that's the price of bonds. And out of the price of bonds, we get interest rates. Well, if we think of liquidity as being a fundamental kind of property of an asset that buyers and sellers care about, then we actually need to introduce a sort of third dimension to the bond market diagram, where liquidity is lurking out there in the third dimension, and so the whole thing moves in sort of a 3D world now. No longer a simply demand and supply type diagram. Okay? Now, you could imagine, oh, let's fix this by having a different demand and supply diagram for each kind of bond, and each kind of bond has its own liquidity properties, and then that's okay. The slopes will look different and so forth. But then the whole point of the demand and supply diagram is to be simple and something we can manipulate, and not have 1,000 different demand and supply diagrams, each of which has their own liquidity sort of alpha parameter value. So that's where we would go if we were going to try to present you with a model of negative liquidity. But here's the good news, we're not going to try and do a model of negative liquidity. That just takes us beyond the text. It takes us beyond where we can go, and no one has sort of invented that kind of model, so I can hardly teach it to you. So, to summarize, we cannot assume a world where bond prices only depend on expected returns, sort of the interest rate idea, price idea, and bond demand now depends on the interest rate plus a measure of liquidity. Bond demand and supply, let's say. Some kind of liquidity thing, which would require a third dimension, a third axis. So we're not going to try to do that. We're not going to try and operate in a three-dimensional diagram model type framework. The last thing I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the Fed and the federal funds rate. Now, I said at the beginning that the federal funds rate is a market interest rate that the Fed can try to target exactly. All the other interest rates, the Fed can only influence in a general way by trading bonds through open market operations and trading other assets too. Okay? So why is it that the Fed can try to influence the federal funds rate of interest in a specific way? And why would it even do that? Let me answer the second question first. The reason for trying to influence the federal funds rate is because that's the rate at which banks make loans to each other. And if you can influence that, then you're going to, through a ripple effect, affect all the other interest rates in the economy. That's thing number one. The other reason you would try to influence the federal funds rate is because you can see the results immediately. The nice thing about the federal funds rate is that it's a rate that is determined almost instantaneously in the markets. It's determined through trade between a relatively small number of banks compared to all the millions of businesses that borrow or lend from regular banks with regular interest rates. So the federal funds rate is a rate the Fed can see, it can get immediate feedback, and it can try to influence. Now, how does the Fed have an advantage in influencing the federal funds rate? That's really the last thing I'm going to talk about. If you really want to know how it works, there is the diagram in my notes and the textbook, and it's probably the hardest diagram you'll see in this course. And the Fed does the following kind of thing. The Fed can not only make a choice about supplying or offering reserves to banks. And remember, banks need to have a certain amount of reserves at the Fed, so they're always interested in that. The Fed can offer sort of a reserve dollars to banks, and it gets to choose the interest rate that it will offer, which it will offer to loan reserves to banks. So this is called the discount rate. And so the Fed effectively can choose the discount rate, and if a bank wants to borrow from the Fed at that discount rate, it can borrow as much as it wants. That's why it's sort of a horizontal line. It's an infinite supply at that rate. Now, by offering a specific discount rate, the Fed effectively caps the ceiling on the federal funds rate, since no bank will want to borrow at a higher rate than the discount rate from a private bank. So it's sort of like the Fed can set an upper limit on the federal funds rate by offering to loan an infinite amount at a certain high rate. Okay, and that's on the diagram there. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, the bank can offer to pay a minimum deposit rate to any bank who puts a deposit at the Fed. So what this does is sets a minimum floor on the federal funds rate. Since no bank acting as a lender will want to lend money to a private bank for a rate that's lower than the deposit rate at the Fed. If I can get 1% loaning to the Fed or putting money on deposit with the Fed, I'm certainly never going to offer to lend to a private bank at 0.5%. Okay? So the Fed, through the deposit rate and the discount rate, effectively sets the range that the market federal funds rate has to lie in. And the last thing the Fed can do is it can put a bunch of reserves of its own. It can offer to supply X billion dollars, a fixed amount of reserves, out there to loan at whatever the federal funds rate will be. It's sort of acting and kind of adding to the supply of reserves. And by choosing the amount it's willing to supply to the market at the federal funds rate, it's able to influence what that market rate will be. Okay, it's able to influence what the private market will pay. And that's what the diagram is about. Don't worry if you don't understand the diagram. It's not that simple to understand. So that's why in this slide I say only if you really, really want to know how it works. I'm not going to test you on this. But just do remember this. The Fed can, through manipulating reserves that it offers for loan and manipulating the discount rate and manipulating the deposit rate, those three things allow it to seriously influence the rate at which private banks lend to each other. The Fed has extra advantages in targeting the federal funds rate that it does not have with respect to the general interest rate. In summary, under normal circumstances, the Fed, through a combination of offering to loan reserves at a certain rate, borrow reserves at a certain rate, put a certain quantity of reserves up for sale, and so forth, it can influence the federal funds rate. But that's under normal conditions. What if banks are in the following abnormal situation, that they are so nervous about liquidity, then it's not so easy for the Fed to control the market interest rate, because fear of insolvency can create an overwhelming demand for liquidity by banks. It's like saying that banks don't care what the interest rate is. They just want to build up their cash reserves because they're afraid that too many of their assets are junk and might turn out to have zero value. So all they care about is avoiding bankruptcy, becoming insolvent. And remember, in this case, we're thinking not just of depository institutions that have some protection, but all the semi-shadow bank institutions too. So you could, when we talk about banks in this context, it could be we're talking about finance companies and insurance companies that are just trying to accumulate as much liquid cash. And by liquid cash, we can also mean treasury bonds too, by the way. So in this case, banks are so desperate for safety, they will hold safe assets even if they give negative interest. So that kind of screws up our traditional model that we just did one slide ago. Now, there are some unconventional policy tools that the textbook talks about toward the end of the chapter, I believe, to try to manage the economy during strange times. Those unconventional policy tools include forward guidance. Forward guidance says the central bank communicates its intentions regarding the future path of monetary policy. So the Fed can try to influence or persuade financial institutions to change their behavior today by promising to do something in future. Now, the problem with that always is a promise is just a promise, and it's not a promise that the Fed can be held to. So the fancy name for that is time consistency, and it's potentially possible the Fed could promise to do something in future, and then when the time comes decides, oh, it's not a good idea to keep to our promise. But when they make the promise in the first place, everybody knows that that could happen. So this time consistency problem means it's difficult to make binding promises about what you'll do in the future, especially if you're the Fed, because you're sort of not really answerable to anybody. Another unconventional policy tool is quantitative easing, and that means the Fed just goes out there and buys lots of junky bonds and pours money into the system and hopes there'll be enough money and liquidity sloshing around that somehow everyone will calm down. And I think you should recall that one of the things the Fed does is it buys not just traditional treasury bonds, but nowadays it can buy all sorts of other securities, which is a big change. And targeted asset purchases, that's a nice word for saying the Fed buys assets that it would not normally have bought in the past in order to take them off the hands of banks and make them less nervous. So I made a particular note. Be sure to skip pages 490 to 505. It's in my lecture notes. And since it's in my lecture notes, it's as good as me saying it. And trying to figure out how to model a new financial world with negative interest rates is beyond what we can do at this point, because it goes beyond the limit of standard theory. That does not mean you cannot write about an article with negative interest rates. It just means that you cannot present a fully developed model and say, well, here's the model that explains it all. We really don't have that kind of model. It goes beyond the limit of standard theory, and feel free to make yourself famous in macroeconomics by inventing a good model of that, okay? That would be an awesome sort of research project or paper you could do that it's not clear to me anyone else has actually thought to do that. Kind of surprising, eh? Okay, so ends the last video, the end. Thanks for watching the videos.